June 23, 1945, Rosenheim, Bavaria. The trumpet's first note cut through the summer air like a blade through silk. Werner Hartmann, age 62, felt his knees buckle. His fingers, those fingers that had once coaxed miracles from violin strings in Munich's National Theater, tightened around the wooden crutch that now held him upright. The American soldier on the makeshift stage couldn't have been more than 22. His olive-drab uniform still crisp despite the Bavarian heat. His cheeks flushed with the kind of nervousness that comes before performance, not battle. And yet the sound that emerged from his instrument, a silver trumpet that caught the late afternoon sun, carried something Werner had not heard in 6 years of war. Hope without irony, beauty without propaganda, music that served nothing but itself. Werner's chest constricted. His right hand, the one not gripping the crutch, moved involuntarily to his face. He was weeping. Around him, in the rubble-strewn square where the Rathaus had stood before British bombers, had reduced it to a jagged skeleton of blackened stone. Hundreds of his neighbors were doing the same. Not the quiet, dignified tears of respectful concert-goers, but the raw, choking sobs of people who had forgotten what it meant to feel anything, beyond hunger, fear, and the grey numbness of defeat. The trumpet played Shenandoah, an American folk melody Werner had never heard before and would never forget after. How had it come to this? How had the victor's music become the first honest thing Werner had heard since his son Karl died screaming in a field hospital outside Stalingrad 3 years prior? How had an enemy's horn broken through the calcified shell around his heart, when every word of German propaganda, every appeal to patriotism, every promise of final victory had only thickened it? The answer lay not in politics or strategy, not in Marshall plans or occupation zones, but in something older and more fundamental. The recognition that music speaks a language that transcends the machinery of nations, that a well-played phrase can bridge chasms that politics only deepens, that sometimes the first step toward healing is simply hearing another human being create beauty without demanding anything in return. This is the story of how American military orchestras transformed post-war Germany, not through conquest, but through concert, not through force, but through fugues. It is the story of Werner Hartmann and Sergeant James Collins, of Herr Müller and a Stradivarius rescued from rubble, of jazz clarinetists and starving symphony musicians who found in each other's company a path back to humanity. It is the story of what happened when the weapons fell silent and the instruments began to speak. The expectation of monsters. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed like a burning house around its defenders, Werner Hartmann had prepared himself to die. Not dramatically, there was no drama left in Germany by then, only exhaustion, but practically. He had seen what happened in the East. His sister's letters from Breslau, arriving sporadically until January, had described the Soviet advance in language so careful it screamed what she dared not write: terror, violation, revenge in its most primal form. When she stopped writing, Werner knew why. So when the Americans arrived in Rosenheim on May 2nd, Werner had hidden his violin, a 19th-century Italian instrument worth more than his house, behind a false panel in the cellar, said goodbye to his wife Greta in a way that needed no words, and waited for the conquerors to exact their payment for 6 years of German aggression. The propaganda machine, even in its death throes, had been clear. The Americans were barely better than the Russians. Mongrelized gangsters from a mongrelized nation, they would plunder, rape, execute. Dr. Goebbels himself had declared it on the radio just weeks before his suicide. The enemy knew no mercy. Surrender meant annihilation. Better to die fighting than to submit to what would follow. Werner had believed perhaps 30% of this. He was no fool. He had lived through the inflation of the 20s, watched the Nazis rise with a musician's skepticism of anyone who promised to make the trains run on time. But 30% belief, mixed with 100% fear, creates a potent compound. He had seen photographs of Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, German cities reduced to moonscapes by American bombers. Men who could rain such destruction from the sky, who could burn 100,000 people alive in a single night, would surely show no gentleness on the ground. The Americans who rolled into Rosenheim on that Tuesday morning arrived in vehicles Werner had never imagined. Massive trucks with wheels taller than a man, tanks that made German panzers look like children's toys, jeeps that seemed to bounce over rubble with mechanical cheerfulness. The noise alone was staggering, not the grinding, struggling sound of German engines starved for oil, but a deep, confident rumble that spoke of unlimited fuel, unlimited parts, unlimited everything. Werner watched from his window as an American soldier, black, which startled him, because he had never seen a black person except in propaganda cartoons, directed traffic, with gestures so casual they seemed almost contemptuous of the war that had just ended. The soldier was chewing something, his jaw working rhythmically. Gum, Werner realized. The man was chewing gum while directing the occupation of a German town. The disconnect was so profound that Werner almost laughed. The executions began immediately. Or, rather, they didn't. This was the first shock. The Americans set up their command post in the Gasthofbräu, the old inn at the town center. They posted guards, young men who looked absurdly healthy compared to the stick-thin German civilians emerging cautiously from their homes. They put up signs in execrable German, fraternization prohibited. They established curfews, searched for weapons, interrogated known Nazi party members, but they did not shoot anyone. They did not burn houses. They did not drag women into alleys. The second shock came 3 days later, on May 5th, when the first American supply trucks rolled into the town square. Werner, watching from a safe distance, saw American soldiers, not the black traffic director or the stern MPs, but ordinary GIs, begin unloading crates. From those crates came white bread, still warm, canned meat, chocolate, powdered milk, medical supplies. Not for themselves, but for German civilians. Werner's neighbor, Frau Schneider, age 74 and half-starved since her ration card had been cut 3 months prior, approached the distribution point with the shuffling gait of someone expecting to be beaten. An American sergeant, red-haired, freckled, 19 years old if he was a day, smiled at her and handed her a box, not threw it at her feet, handed it to her, like she was a person. Frau Schneider stood there holding the box, staring at the American, her face doing something Werner had never seen, trying to reconcile expectation with reality, propaganda with evidence, hatred with kindness. She began to cry, not from gratitude yet, but from the sheer cognitive dissonance of receiving food from someone she had been taught to see as a monster. The third shock was the most profound, though it took weeks to fully register. The Americans were efficient, not in the brutal, mechanistic way of the SUS, but in a way that suggested vast resources deployed with casual competence. Within a week, they had repaired the water system the Wehrmacht had sabotaged during their retreat. Within 2 weeks, they had organized medical clinics, treating German civilians alongside American soldiers. Within 3 weeks, they had established a functioning food distribution network that delivered more calories to Rosenheim's residents than they had seen since 1942. Werner, limping through town on his crutch, the injury that would shape his fate was still 2 weeks away, watched American engineers rebuild the bridge over the Inn River. They worked in shifts around the clock with equipment that seemed to assemble itself. They sang while they worked. Not martial songs, but popular tunes, jazz melodies, things with titles like Chattanooga Choo Choo and Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree. One of them had a harmonica and played it during breaks, casual improvisations that drifted over the construction site like smoke. This was the context, the psychological landscape in which the orchestras arrived. The ground had been prepared not by policy, but by 1,000 small mercies, 1,000 contradictions between what Germans had been told and what they experienced. The Americans had proven they were not monsters. Now they would prove they were something more surprising. Fellow human beings who valued the same things, beauty, harmony, transcendence, that Germans valued. But Werner didn't know that yet. On June 1st, 1945, he was still adjusting to being alive, to having enough food, to the strange new world where enemy soldiers repaired your bridges and shared their chocolate with children. He was still numb, still wrapped in the protective blanket of not feeling too much because feeling anything meant feeling everything. Karl's death, the 6 years of lies, the complicity and guilt and shame that came with surviving what he had supported. Even passively, even skeptically. Then came the concert announcement. The injury June 8th. The Bavarian sun hung fat and gold at 6 in the evening, casting long shadows through the skeletal remains of what had been Rosenheim's commercial district. Werner was helping clear rubble from the Marienplatz, not because the Americans had ordered it, but because sitting still meant thinking, and thinking led to places he wasn't ready to visit. His muscles, soft from years of musician's work and months of starvation, screamed protest with every lifted stone. Sweat darkened his shirt, the same shirt he had worn for 3 weeks because it was the only one without holes. The wall fell without warning. One moment, Werner was prying loose a brick from a pile. The next, the entire section of wall above, weakened by fire, held together by hope and stubbornness, chose that instant to surrender to gravity. Later, witnesses would say it made a sound like a sigh before it crashed down. Werner heard nothing. He felt only the massive weight crushing his left leg, felt bones snap like dry kindling, felt a pain so pure and absolute it erased thought itself. He screamed. Later still, when the morphine allowed memory, he would be ashamed of that scream, not because men shouldn't cry out in pain, but because the sound that emerged from his throat was his son's name. Karl, Karl, as if calling for his dead boy could undo the bricks, rewind time, bring back everything that had been crushed. Hands, many hands, lifted the rubble. German hands, neighbor hands, people he had known for decades, suddenly galvanized by emergency. They dug him free, with a frenzied efficiency, born of having lost too much already, to lose more. When they finally pulled him clear, Werner's left leg hung at an angle that legs should never hang. Blood, an astonishing amount of blood, soaked into the thirsty rubble, darkening the dust to rust. Krankenhaus, someone said. The hospital. But Rosenheim's hospital was a hospital only in name. Most of its supplies had been looted during the chaotic final days of German control. Its doctors dead or fled, its wards filled with wounded Wehrmacht soldiers who received only basic care because there was nothing more to give. He'll die there, someone else said. Not cruelly, just stating fact. Werner's vision swam. The pain was discovering new dimensions, growing from acute to all-consuming. He felt his consciousness dimming, felt his body deciding that sleep, or something like it, was preferable to this. He welcomed it. Then came voices in English, American voices, sharp commands in a language Werner understood only fragments of. Through his narrowing tunnel of vision, he saw olive-drab uniforms, medics. 2 of them knelt beside him, their faces young and worried in a way that Werner's fogged brain found oddly touching. They were worried about him. The enemy was worried about him. One medic, later Werner would learn his name, was Private First Class Thomas Chen, age 20, from San Francisco. A man who had lied about his age to enlist at 17, spoke to Werner in careful, accented German. Herr, you, hospital, American, good hospital, you, live, verstehen? Werner tried to answer but managed only a whimper. The medics were already moving. efficient as machines, but somehow more gentle than machines could be. They splinted his leg with pneumatic swiftness, started an IV line when German civilians had been making do with boiled rags for bandages, and lifted him onto a stretcher. The morphine hit his bloodstream with the subtlety of a symphony's crescendo. Pain didn't disappear, but suddenly became distant. Someone else's problem. A telegram from a far country. The ambulance, a real ambulance, not a requisitioned truck, drove with what felt like reckless speed. Werner, floating on his chemical cloud, stared at the canvas ceiling and tried to comprehend what was happening. They were taking him to an American medical facility. An American medical facility would treat him, a German, a former member, passive but still a member, of the Nazi Party because you couldn't work in the municipal orchestra without joining. A citizen of the nation that had just killed 400,000 American soldiers. They were going to save him. The Feldlazaret, field hospital, had been set up in a requisitioned school building on Rosenheim's outskirts. Werner, drifting between consciousness and morphine dreams, registered impressions. Bright lights, brighter than anything he'd seen in years. The smell of antiseptic, sharp and clean. American voices speaking quickly, coordinating. The sensation of being transferred from stretcher to operating table. A masked face looming above him, eyes crinkling in what might have been a smile. "You're going to be fine," someone said in German. Not Chen, but an older voice, authoritative and kind. "We're going to fix your leg. When you wake up it will hurt, but it will heal. Do you understand?" Werner tried to nod. He wanted to say something. "Thank you," or "Why are you doing this?" or "I don't deserve this." But the anesthetic was already pulling him under, and the last thing he heard before consciousness disappeared was someone in the operating theater whistling. Whistling a melody Werner didn't recognize, something American and optimistic and utterly inappropriate for surgery, and yet somehow perfect. A reminder that even in the business of saving lives, there was room for music. The awakening Werner woke to whiteness. White ceiling, white walls, white sheets on the cot where he lay. For a disorienting moment he thought he had died, and this was whatever came after. Not heaven exactly, because his leg throbbed with a deep, sullen ache that suggested very physical consequences. But some intermediate place where pain existed, but death did not. Then he turned his head and saw the ward. 24 cots arranged in neat rows, most occupied by men in various states of injury. Some wore American uniforms. Some wore German civilian clothes. A few wore the gray-green of the Wehrmacht. Prisoners, presumably, though no one was shackled or guarded beyond a single MP who sat by the door reading a magazine with a lurid cover. No segregation, no waiting line. Germans treated alongside Americans with what appeared to be the same level of care. Werner stared at this tableau, this impossible, propaganda-defying scene, with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle whose existence he had not suspected. A nurse appeared at his bedside, female, American, perhaps 30 years old, her uniform starched and her manner brisk but not unkind. "You're awake," she said in serviceable German. "Good. How is your pain from 1 to 10? Werner tried to speak, discovered his mouth was cotton, managed a whisper. 7. "I'll get you something." She made a note on a clipboard, such mundane efficiency, and moved to fetch medication. She returned with pills and water, helped him sit up enough to swallow them, adjusted his pillows with practiced efficiency. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "You were very brave in surgery. The doctor said you didn't complain." Werner blinked. "I was unconscious. Before that, when they brought you in." She patted his shoulder, actually patted his shoulder, a gesture so casually compassionate that Werner felt his throat tighten, and moved to the next patient. He lay there, processing. He was in an American military hospital. He had received surgery immediately upon arrival. Immediately, with no waiting line, no triage that prioritized American soldiers over German civilians. Someone had operated on him, set his leg with pins and plaster, given him blood transfusions. He could see the needle marks on his arms, administered morphine and God knew what else. Someone had saved his leg, possibly his life, and expected nothing in return except perhaps that he rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that Werner felt dizzy. Every assumption, every certainty carefully cultivated by 6 years of propaganda, was crumbling. The Americans were not monsters. The Americans were not even indifferent conquerors dispensing rough justice. The Americans were, what? Doctors, nurses, people who whistled while they worked and saved the lives of their enemies' civilians without apparent resentment. Over the next 3 days, as Werner recovered in the ward, the evidence accumulated. He watched American medics treat German soldiers with the same care they gave their own. He saw doctors make rounds, examining wounds with clinical detachment that treated all patients as problems to solve rather than symbols to punish. He heard, through the ward's thin walls, a heated argument between 2 American surgeons about the best way to treat a German boy's infected wound, an argument that ended with one doctor slapping the other on the back and saying, "Fine, do it your way, but if the kid dies, you're buying drinks for a month." The boy didn't die. He recovered, left the ward walking, waved goodbye to his American doctors with a hand that would have been amputated under German care. Werner began to understand, slowly, painfully, like muscles remembering how to move, that he had lived 6 years inside a lie, so encompassing it had colored every perception. Not that Germany had been right. He had known, in the way one knows things too dangerous to acknowledge, that the regime was evil. But he had believed the counter-lie, that everyone was evil, that the only difference between Germans and their enemies was which side won, that mercy was weakness and kindness was propaganda, and the world was nothing but power struggling against power until exhaustion brought temporary peace. But here was mercy that expected no propaganda victory in return. Here was kindness that came not from weakness but from strength so vast it could afford to be gentle. Here was a vision of power that included, as one of its expressions, the unhesitating decision to save the life of a German musician whose country had killed 400,000 American soldiers. On his 4th day in the ward, as the pain subsided enough to allow thought beyond the immediate, Werner asked the nurse. Her name was Lieutenant Mary O'Connor, from Boston, age 32, a woman whose brother had died on Omaha Beach, why the Americans were doing this. She paused in changing his dressing, looked at him with eyes that held experience of things she would never discuss. "Because you're hurt," she said finally. "What else would we do?" It was both the simplest and most radical answer Werner had ever heard. The violin in the rubble. June 19th, Werner, released from the hospital on crutches with instructions to return for follow-up care, hobbled back to his house on Schillerstrasse. His leg was encased in plaster from hip to ankle, heavy as stone, forcing him to move with a 3-legged gait that exhausted him after 30 meters. But he was alive. His leg would heal. He would walk again, even if with a limp. These facts, mundane, miraculous, filled his mind with a kind of stunned gratitude that had no object. Grateful to whom? To what? To the American surgeon whose name he hadn't learned. To chance? To God, if God existed, which Werner had stopped believing on the day Karl died. Greta met him at the door, her face collapsing into relief and tears. She had thought him dead. For 3 days she had thought him dead, because no one could tell her where the Americans had taken him, and the old German hospital said they had no record, and the Americans wouldn't let civilians into their facilities without authorization. She had mourned him, prepared herself for another absence to join the absence of their son, another hole in the fabric of their life. Now he was back, broken but back. She held him carefully, avoiding his injured leg, and for the first time since Karl's death, Werner let himself weep, not the controlled tears of grief, but the messy, choking sobs of a man who had expected to die and found himself instead in his wife's arms, smelling her familiar scent of soap and old linen, feeling her heart beat against his chest. They stood there in the doorway, two survivors clinging to each other, until a neighbor passed and politely looked away. That night, after Greta fed him soup made from American supplies, real chicken, not the sawdust and hope concoctions they'd survived on for years, Werner descended to the cellar. The stairs were torture for his leg, each step a negotiation with pain, but he needed to know. The false panel was still in place. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, lay his violin. He brought it upstairs with the delicacy of a man handling an infant. In the lamplight, electricity was still intermittent. He unwrapped the instrument and examined it. Matteo Goffria, Venice, 1713. Acquired by Werner's grandfather in 1884, for a sum that represented 3 years of a postal clerk's salary. The wood glowed amber in the lamplight, the varnish still perfect, despite years of hiding. Werner lifted it, settled it against his shoulder, felt the familiar weight and balance. Then he tried to play. His fingers, stiff from disuse and trauma, fumbled the positions. His bow arm, weakened by starvation and injury, trembled. The sound that emerged was thin, scratchy, a parody of the rich tone he had once commanded. Werner played Bach, the Partita No. 2 in D minor, the chaconne that had been his signature piece, and heard instead a struggle, a failing, a distance between intention and execution that made him want to weep. He had been first violin in Munich's National Theatre Orchestra from 1926 until 1939, when Jewish members were expelled, and Werner, to his eternal shame, had kept his position, had played for audiences that included men in SS uniforms, had collected his salary while colleagues disappeared. He had told himself he was just a musician, that art transcended politics, that someone would have taken his chair if he refused it. All the comfortable lies that had let him sleep at night. Then the war had consumed everything. The orchestra reduced, then dissolved. Musicians sent to the front or the factories. Werner himself relegated to teaching in the municipal music school, watching his students grow thinner and more desperate as the Reich ate itself. And then, Karl, who had been 17 when they took him. Karl, who played piano like an angel. Karl, who had died screaming in the mud outside Stalingrad. Werner lowered the violin. His hands shook. He had survived. But what had survived in him? The skill was there, buried under months of disuse, potentially recoverable. But the will, the belief that music mattered, the conviction that beauty was worth creating, these seemed to have died with Karl. Greta appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound. "Werner," she said gently, "don't force it. Give yourself time." But Werner didn't have time. He was 62 years old. He had perhaps 10, 15 good years left if he was lucky. What would he do with them? Teach children in a town that had lost a generation of young men. Play in provincial orchestras for audiences who came only to forget. Retreat into the comfortable numbness of survival without purpose. He was still wrestling with these questions when the announcement came. The announcement, the notice appeared on June 20th on the bulletin board outside the American command post, typed in both English and German, Special Concert United States Army Orchestra, June 23, 1945. 18 hours Marienplatz, all civilians, welcome, no admission charge. Werner read it 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding. An orchestra, an American military orchestra, performing for German civilians, for free. The bulletin board became a gathering point. Germans clustered around it, reading and rereading the notice, speaking in the careful, oblique way people spoke when they didn't know who might be listening. Some were skeptical. It's propaganda. They want to make us feel grateful. It's a trap somehow. But beneath the skepticism lay something else. Curiosity, hope, the hunger for beauty that had been starved for 6 years. Werner learned more from Herr Bachmann, the postal clerk who somehow always knew everything. The orchestra was part of the Third Army Special Services Unit, Bachmann explained, sent to occupied territories to boost morale, primarily for American troops. But the performances were open to civilians. They weren't playing military marches or patriotic anthems. They were playing real music, classical, jazz, popular songs, whatever their conductor chose. "I heard they played in Stuttgart last month," Bachmann said, lowering his voice though there was no one near to overhear. "Someone told me Germans were crying. Not from sadness, from hearing music again. Good music, played well." Werner felt something stir in his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. The next 3 days passed with excruciating slowness. Werner practiced his violin, morning and evening, forcing his reluctant fingers through scales and arpeggios, feeling the muscle memory slowly reassert itself. He didn't know why he was practicing, didn't think he would play publicly, didn't imagine the Americans would care about one more musician in a town full of them. But he practiced anyway because it gave him something to do, besides think. Rosenheim prepared for the concert with an intensity that surprised everyone, including the Americans. Despite having nothing, people tried to make themselves presentable. Clothes were washed in cold water, shoes polished with spit and ashes, hair cut by amateur barbers. It was dignity asserting itself, the human impulse to meet beauty properly dressed even when poverty left only tatters to wear. The Americans, bemused by this enthusiasm, erected a proper stage in the Marienplatz, using construction materials diverted from rebuilding projects. They hung lights, electric lights powered by their generators, and arranged benches salvaged from bombed churches. The soldiers working on the stage sang while they hammered, and Werner, watching from a distance, recognized the tune. "Take the A-Train," the Duke Ellington piece he had heard once on a forbidden jazz recording before the war, when he was younger and thought jazz was frivolous music for frivolous times. Now it sounded like freedom. June 23rd arrived clear and warm, the Bavarian sky an improbable blue that seemed designed for better days. By 5 in the evening, the Marienplatz was filling. Germans arrived early, claiming spots with the same intensity they once brought to ration lines. They sat on the salvaged benches, stood at the edges, leaned against walls. A silent crowd, expectant but uncertain, like people who had forgotten what it meant to attend a concert. Werner arrived at 17:30, hobbling on his crutch, Greta supporting his other arm. They found a spot near the front, close enough to see the stage clearly. The orchestra was assembling, 23 musicians in American uniforms, unpacking instruments with the casual efficiency of professionals. Werner's trained eye cataloged what he saw, a proper brass section, woodwinds, strings, percussion. This was not a makeshift military band, but a real orchestra, musicians who knew their craft. He noticed the trumpet player immediately. Young, heartbreakingly young, with sandy hair and a nervous habit of licking his lips before playing. The trumpeter was first chair, Werner realized, which meant he was good, very good. You didn't get first chair in a military orchestra through connections or luck. You earned it through skill. The conductor stepped onto the podium. A captain, older than the musicians, perhaps 40, with the bearing of a man who had led orchestras before leading them in uniform. He raised his baton, a real baton, not a stick or a ruler, and the orchestra came to attention with a precision that spoke of countless rehearsals. The captain spoke in accented but comprehensible German. "Good evening. We are the Third Army Orchestra. Tonight we play for you. We hope you enjoy the music." That was all. No speech about peace, no lecture about democracy, no propaganda. Just music. The baton fell, and the orchestra began. Shenandoah, the trumpet, sang alone at first, unaccompanied, the melody rising clear and pure into the evening air. Werner, who prided himself on his musical knowledge, didn't recognize the piece. It was American, something folk-derived, simple in structure, but profound in execution. The trumpeter played it with a restraint that made every note matter, a tone that carried both sadness and hope in equal measure. "Oh, Shenandoah, I long to hear you." Werner didn't know the words, but he didn't need them. The melody said everything. Longing for home, memory of beauty, grief for what was lost, belief in what might yet be found. It was a traveler's song, an exile's song, a soldier's song for the moment after battle when the gun falls silent and the man realizes he's still alive. The orchestra entered on the second verse, strings first, adding harmonic depth, then woodwinds weaving counterpoint, then brass, supporting the trumpet's continuing melody. The arrangement was sophisticated, nothing like the simple folk tune it had begun as. But the sophistication served the emotion, rather than displaying technique for technique's sake. Werner felt his throat tighten. Around him, the crowd had gone perfectly still, that particular stillness that comes when 500 people simultaneously stop breathing. No one moved, no one coughed, no one did anything but listen as the American orchestra transformed the Marienplatz. This space of rubble and absence, this square where the Rathaus had stood for 300 years until British bombs erased it, into a cathedral of sound. The trumpet climbed higher, the melody reaching towards something just beyond grasp, and Werner felt something break inside him. Not break like his leg had broken, sharp and painful and requiring surgery. Break like ice breaks in spring, the sudden release of something frozen too long. He was weeping, openly, uncontrollably, tears streaming down his face without shame or attempt at concealment. Around him, dozens, scores, hundreds of his neighbors were doing the same. Old men who had survived 2 wars, young women who had lost husbands and brothers and fathers, children who had known nothing but fear and hunger, all of them crying, not from grief exactly, though grief was part of it, but from the shock of remembering that beauty existed, that culture persisted, that someone could play a trumpet, and through that simple act affirm that humanity was more than survival. The music ended. The last note hung in the air, fading slowly, reluctant to leave. Silence followed. Not the silence of emptiness, but the pregnant silence that comes after great art, when the audience needs a moment to return to themselves. Then applause. Hesitant at first, as if Germans weren't sure they were allowed, then building to a roar that echoed off the ruined buildings, bouncing back and forth across the square in waves of sound that rivaled the orchestra itself. The conductor bowed. The orchestra bowed. The young trumpeter, his face flushed with emotion or exertion or both, bowed deeply, and Werner saw that he too had tears on his cheeks. The concert continued. They played Brahms, the academic festival overture, chosen deliberately, Werner thought, to honor German culture, to say, "We know you had this, we know you created beauty, we know you are more than the regime that ruled you." They played Gershwin, those syncopated rhythms that seemed impossible to notate but flowed like water when played well. They played America the Beautiful and the Battle Hymn of the Republic, pieces Werner should have resented as victory music, but instead heard as human expressions of hope and belonging. And between pieces, during the brief pauses when the orchestra rested and the conductor mopped his brow, Werner noticed something extraordinary. The Americans were looking at the German audience with genuine interest, genuine desire to communicate. This wasn't performance as dominance. This was performance as conversation, as extended hand, as the musical equivalent of "We are here, you are here, we are all human beings, let us make something beautiful together." When the concert ended, After 90 minutes that felt both eternal and instantaneous, the crowd didn't want to leave. They applauded until their hands hurt, called for encores until their voices gave out, stood in the twilight holding on to the experience, like climbers holding onto a rope that leads to safety. Werner stood there on his crutch, hand cramping from clapping, face wet with tears he hadn't tried to stop, and felt something he hadn't felt since before Karl died. Maybe since before the war, possibly since before the Nazis rose. Hope, not the cheap, propagandistic hope of inevitable victory or thousand-year Reichs. Real hope, fragile and human and earned through the simple act of witnessing other human beings create beauty and share it freely. The crowd began to disperse. The orchestra packed their instruments with the same casual efficiency they'd unpacked them. Werner stood there, unable to move, watching the Americans work. He wanted to say something, to thank someone, to communicate the enormity of what they had done. But his English was limited. His voice was choked with emotion, and what words could capture what he felt? Then he saw the trumpeter, the young one, the first chair, setting his instrument in its case. Werner made a decision without quite deciding, found himself moving toward the stage, hobbling on his crutch, Greta calling after him in concern. The trumpeter looked up as Werner approached. Up close, he was even younger than Werner had thought. 22 at most, with eyes that held both kindness and exhaustion. He saw Werner's tears, saw the crutch, saw something in Werner's face that made him smile with a gentleness that seemed impossible in someone wearing a conqueror's uniform. "Hello," the trumpeter said in careful German. "Did you enjoy the music?" Werner nodded, unable to speak. He pointed to himself, then mimed playing violin, hoping to communicate. "I am a musician, too. I understand what you did. I know what it cost and what it gave." The trumpeter's face lit up. "You play violin," he said in English, then in German. "Geige." Werner nodded again, managed to choke out, "Munich. Orchestra. Before." The American's smile widened. He extended his hand, a handshake, that gesture of equals, and said in English what Werner somehow understood perfectly. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." Werner took the hand. American hand, German hand, musician's hand meeting musician's hand. Human being acknowledging human being across the chasm of war and language and history. "James," the trumpeter said, pointing to himself. "James Collins, from Ohio. Werner," Werner managed. "Werner Hartmann, from here." They stood there, hands clasped, two men who should have been enemies finding in music a language that transcended enmity. The violin speaks again. What happened next became legend in Rosenheim, the kind of story people told for decades after, arguing about details that memory had rendered uncertain while agreeing on the essence. That night, in the Marienplatz, magic happened. Collins gestured to Werner's violin case. Werner had brought it without quite knowing why, carrying it under his arm, despite the awkwardness of the crutch. "May I see?" Collins asked, pantomiming the question. Werner opened the case with trembling hands, revealed the Gofferler. Collins whistled low. That universal musician's appreciation for a fine instrument. He looked at Werner, silently asking permission. Werner nodded. Collins lifted the violin with the reverence it deserved, examined it in the fading light, plucked a string gently to test its tuning. "Beautiful," he said in English. Then, in halting German, "You, play, now." Werner froze. Play, now, here. In front of the Americans, in front of his neighbors, with fingers that barely remembered their craft and a soul that had forgotten why music mattered. His first impulse was to refuse, to retreat, to preserve what was left of his dignity by not exposing his weakened skill. But Collins was holding out the violin with such hope in his eyes, such genuine desire to hear Werner play, that refusal seemed impossible. This young American, who had just given Werner back his belief that beauty existed, was asking for something in return. Not submission or gratitude, but participation, partnership, the chance to make music together. Werner took the violin, settled it against his shoulder, felt its familiar weight, its familiar curve, lifted the bow with a hand that shook visibly. Collins stood beside him, trumpet ready. "Together?" he asked. "Bach." Werner nodded. "Bach. The universal language of musicians, the composer who belonged to everyone and no one, whose mathematics of beauty transcended nation and time." They chose the air from the orchestral suite No. 3 in D major. Simple enough to play from memory, profound enough to carry meaning. Werner drew the first note. It emerged thin and wavering, his tone weak, his vibrato inconsistent. He wanted to stop, to apologize, to explain that he had once been better than this. But Collins, hearing Werner's melody, added his trumpet voice underneath. Not leading, not correcting, but supporting, harmonizing, making Werner's imperfect violin sound less imperfect through the grace of accompaniment. They played in the gathering darkness, light fading from the sky, the Marienplatz emptying around them, and Werner felt something extraordinary happening. His fingers were remembering. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, like a language long disused coming back through conversation. The tone strengthened, the vibrato steadied, the bow arm found its old confidence. By the second statement of the melody, Werner was no longer fighting the violin but dancing with it, and Collins's trumpet was no longer compensating for weakness but celebrating strength. The two instruments wove together: American trumpet, German violin, jazz musician, and symphony player, former enemies, making harmony that neither could have created alone. People stopped leaving. The crowd that had been dispersing now reformed, drawn back by the sound of two musicians discovering each other through Bach. Germans stood silent, listening to their former conqueror and their own first violin create something neither battle nor bombing had destroyed: the human capacity for beauty. When they finished, when the last note faded into the Bavarian night, the applause was different from before, less overwhelming, more intimate. The recognition that they had witnessed not just performance but transformation. Werner remembering he was a musician, Collins discovering he had found a colleague. The German audience learning that the Americans had come not just with food and medicine, but with the thing Germans prided themselves on most: culture. Collins shook Werner's hand again, harder this time. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Practice? Together?" Werner nodded, unable to speak for the emotion choking his throat. "I have 2 weeks here," Collins continued in his broken German. "We make music? Teach each other?" "Yes," Werner managed in English, one of the 3 English words he knew. "Yes." They parted. Collins back to the American barracks, Werner hobbling home with Greta, his violin case feeling lighter than it had in years. The crutch still tortured his armpits, the leg still throbbed, the ruins still surrounded them on all sides. Nothing material had changed. Everything had changed. The 2 weeks that followed, the story of Werner Hartmann and James Collins became, in the next 14 days, the story of Rosenheim's resurrection. Not its physical resurrection. That would take years, decades, leaving scars that persisted into the 21st century. But its spiritual resurrection, the moment when a town remembered it was more than rubble and ration cards. They met daily, Werner and Collins, in an undamaged rehearsal room at the music school that American engineers had restored. Collins brought other orchestra members: a clarinetist from New York named Jacob Rosenberg, who spoke fluent German and translated when music couldn't; a cellist from Georgia named William Harper, who had never seen snow before Germany and couldn't stop marveling at the Alps visible in the distance. A French horn player from Minnesota named Margaret Sullivan, one of only 3 women in the orchestra, whose presence caused minor scandals among the more traditional Rosenheimers until they heard her play and realized gender was irrelevant when someone could make a horn sing like that. Werner brought Greta, who played piano well enough to provide accompaniment. He brought Herr Müller, the old violinist Collins had noticed in the crowd, whose trembling hands steadied when they held a bow. He brought Frau Dietrich, a cellist whose husband had died at Kursk, whose instrument had survived bombing only because she'd carried it to the shelter every night. He brought Carl Fischer, age 16, a clarinet prodigy, whose family had hidden him from the last desperate Volkssturm conscriptions. They made music. Not perfectly. The Germans were rusty, undernourished, carrying grief that manifested in hesitant phrasing and uncertain intonation. The Americans were tired, missing home, dealing with their own traumas from battles they didn't discuss. But perfection wasn't the point. Communication was the point. Bridge building. The daily, deliberate choice to see each other as colleagues rather than conquerors and conquered. Collins taught Werner jazz phrasing, that syncopated freedom that made strict Germans uncomfortable, until they tried it and discovered liberation in improvisation. Werner taught Collins German folk melodies, 300-year-old songs about mountains and rivers and love that Collins arranged for trumpet with such sensitivity that even old Herr Bachmann, who had loudly proclaimed jazz to be degenerate music, admitted it sounded beautiful. They performed, not formally at first, but impromptu concerts in the streets, in the hospital ward where Werner had recovered, in the American mess hall where German musicians were suddenly welcome as guests. The repertoire was eclectic, impossible, magnificent. Bach followed by Ellington, Brahms followed by Stardust, Schubert, Lieder arranged for trumpet and violin that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. The American soldiers watched these musical collaborations with something like wonder. They had expected to occupy Germany with stern efficiency, to maintain professional distance, to see Germans as the enemy defeated, but not quite trusted. Instead, they found themselves sharing music stands with former enemies, teaching and being taught, discovering that Nazis were one thing, but people who loved Brahms were harder to hate. The German civilians experienced a parallel transformation. They had expected punishment, if not death, then perpetual judgment. The burden of guilt pressed down until it crushed whatever humanity remained. Instead, they found Americans who wanted to play music with them, who valued their cultural heritage, even while rejecting the regime that had perverted it, who seemed to believe that a German violinist and an American trumpeter could stand side by side without history's weight, preventing harmony. Not everyone approved. Some American officers worried about fraternization, about soldiers going soft, about the propaganda value the Germans might extract from friendly relations. Some Germans muttered about collaboration, about forgetting too quickly the sons and husbands who had died fighting these same Americans, about pride and dignity and not accepting charity from the victors. But music has a way of overwhelming objections. When Herr Müller and Collins performed together in the hospital ward, Müller on violin, Collins on trumpet, playing Schumann's Traumerei arranged for their instruments, even the hardest-hearted skeptic had to acknowledge something profound was happening. The German patients in their beds, some missing limbs, all missing futures, wept openly. The American medics who had stitched those same patients' wounds stood at attention as if music were the flag they had sworn to serve. On July 3rd, Collins' last day in Rosenheim before his unit moved to Munich, they organized a final concert. This time the collaboration was official. The American orchestra and a hastily assembled German ensemble, 13 musicians in total, performing together on the rebuilt stage in the Marienplatz. The program was ambitious to the point of absurdity. They played Beethoven's Symphony No. 7, second movement, the funeral march that needed full orchestra, but which they attempted anyway with their reduced forces, filling gaps through sheer determination and creative arrangement. They played American spirituals that Collins had grown up with, songs of suffering and transcendence that German musicians approached with reverent care. They played German drinking songs that American soldiers knew from bars and occupation duty, melodies that suddenly sounded less like enemy music and more like human joy. For the finale, Werner and Collins performed the piece they had worked on together, Bach's double violin concerto, arranged for violin and trumpet. It was technically impossible. Bach hadn't written it for those instruments, but they played it anyway, two voices intertwining, question and answer, statement and response, German tradition and American innovation, creating something neither alone could have achieved. The crowd, now German and American, civilians and soldiers, former enemies sitting together on salvaged benches, erupted in applause that seemed to shake the rubble. They stood and cheered until their throats were raw, until the musicians' hands cramped from acknowledging applause, until even the gruff American colonel, who had been suspicious of the whole endeavor, was seen wiping his eyes. After the concert, as the crowd dispersed into the July twilight, Collins found Werner backstage. The trumpeter's eyes were red from crying. Not unusual anymore. Everyone cried at these concerts, and his voice broke when he spoke. "I have to tell you something," Collins said in English, with Rosenberg translating. "When I came to Germany, I hated you. All of you. My brother died in Normandy. My best friend lost his legs at the Bulge. I wanted you to suffer. I wanted you to pay for what you'd done." Werner nodded. He understood. "But then I met you," Collins continued, "and Herr Müller, and Frau Dietrich, and I realized. You did suffer. You are paying, and hating you doesn't bring my brother back, doesn't give my friend his legs. All it does is poison me." Collins paused, struggled for words. "Music saved me," he finally said. "Playing with you, teaching Karl, learning from Herr Müller. It gave me back something I lost in the war. Something I thought was gone forever. The belief that people are more than the worst things their countries do." Werner found his voice. "You saved me first," he said, through Rosenberg's translation. "In the hospital, yes, but also tonight, and every day we played together. You reminded me why I became a musician, not for glory or money or applause, but because music is the one thing that proves we are more than animals. Because beauty matters. Because harmony is possible." They embraced, awkwardly, because men in 1945 didn't embrace easily, especially men from different countries, different generations, different worlds. But they embraced anyway, holding each other, while around them the Marienplatz emptied and the stars came out over the ruins of Rosenheim. Collins left the next morning. His unit drove away in a convoy of trucks and jeeps, heading to Munich for the next occupation assignment. Werner stood at the roadside with his crutch, watching them go, feeling the absence like a physical wound. But this wound was different from his broken leg, different from Karl's death. This wound came from connection, from having found something precious and having to release it. And that kind of wound, Werner was learning, could heal into something stronger than what had been there before. The legacy. July turned to August, August to September. The Americans remained, but different Americans. New units, new faces, new officers who hadn't been at the June concert and didn't quite understand why Rosenheim's Germans kept asking when the orchestra would return. Collins wrote once, a letter in careful English that Werner had Rosenberg translate. "Dear Werner, I think of you and our music often. The orchestra is performing in Munich now, and last week we had 3 German musicians sit in with us. Because of what we started in Rosenheim, it's becoming normal to play with Germans, to teach and learn together. You showed me that was possible. I will never forget our 2 weeks. I hope your leg is healing. I hope you are playing every day. I hope you remember what we proved, that music is stronger than hatred. Your friend, James." Werner did play every day. His leg healed slowly, leaving him with a permanent limp but full use of his hands. He reformed the municipal orchestra. 10 musicians at first, then 15, then 20 as survivors returned and refugees arrived, bringing instruments and skill. They had no concert hall. The old one was rubble, so they played in churches, in schools, in the American mess hall, where they were always welcome. The repertoire reflected their new reality. German classics alongside American pieces, Bach and Beethoven sharing programs with Gershwin and Copland, folk songs from both nations, arranged for whatever instruments they had available. The audiences were mixed too, Germans and Americans sitting together, sometimes awkwardly, but always peacefully, united by their love of music or at least their need for something beyond survival. Young Carl Fischer, the clarinet prodigy, became Werner's protégé. The boy had a gift: perfect pitch, natural phrasing, and a work ethic born of having survived war by hiding in basements. Werner taught him everything: classical technique, jazz improvisation, the difference between playing notes and making music. Carl absorbed it all with desperate intensity, as if music were the only thing preventing him from drowning in memory. "Why are you teaching me American music?" Carl asked once, when Werner insisted he learn Rhapsody in Blue. "Because jazz is freedom," Werner answered, "and because the Americans taught me that good music has no nationality, only good musicians and bad musicians, regardless of where they were born." Carl nodded, understanding more than Werner said. The boy had lost his father, his 2 older brothers, his childhood. But he had music, and through music he had purpose, and through purpose he had a future. By 1946, Rosenheim's musical renaissance was becoming known throughout Bavaria. Conductors came from Munich, from Stuttgart, from the American occupation headquarters in Frankfurt. Curious about this small town where Germans and Americans made music together as if war had never happened. Some came skeptical, expecting propaganda or forced collaboration. All left impressed, occasionally moved to tears by the genuine artistry and mutual respect they witnessed. In Stuttgart, the encounter between American jazz musicians and German symphony players became a scheduled event. Monthly concerts where orchestras merged, where improvisation met composition, where disciplined precision learned to swing. In Munich, the Philharmonic, decimated by war, its Jewish members murdered, its hall destroyed, rebuilt itself with American assistance, both financial and musical. American music teachers came to German conservatories. German musicians studied jazz in special classes organized by the occupation authorities. Children who attended these mixed concerts grew up believing reconciliation was normal, that former enemies could become friends, that culture was stronger than politics. They carried this belief into adulthood, into the economic miracle of the 50s, into the complicated relationship between Germany and America that would define the second half of the 20th century. Werner kept teaching, kept playing, kept organizing concerts until 1963, when arthritis finally forced his retirement. He was 80 years old, had lived through 2 world wars, had survived Nazism and occupation, and the slow, painful reconstruction of his country. He died in 1967, peacefully, in his sleep, with his violin, the Goffreler that had survived hiding and war, in its case beside his bed. At his funeral, Carl Fischer, now first clarinet in the Berlin Philharmonic, played Bach's Air on his instrument, the same piece Werner and Collins had performed that first night in the Marienplatz. An American trumpeter, visiting Germany on tour, heard about the funeral and came uninvited, stood at the back of the church and played Shenandoah as the coffin was carried out. No one knew who he was. He left before anyone could ask. But those who had been at the original concert recognized the melody, recognized the gesture, and understood. The tradition Werner and Collins had started, lived on, passed from musician to musician, generation to generation. A reminder that even in the darkest times, music offers a path toward light. Epilogue. What they proved, the story of American military orchestras in post-war Germany, is not primarily a story of cultural diplomacy, though it was that. It is not primarily a story of denazification through art, though elements of that exist. It is, at its core, a story about what humans need, beyond food and shelter, beyond physical survival, the need for beauty, for meaning, for the affirmation that life is more than mere existence. The Germans who wept at those concerts in 1945 were not weeping from gratitude, at least not primarily. They were weeping from recognition, the sudden, overwhelming realization that they were still human, still capable of feeling something beyond pain and fear, still connected to the transcendent values that propaganda had tried to pervert but couldn't destroy. The Americans who played for German audiences were not engaging in calculated psychological warfare, though military authorities hoped for that outcome. They were simply doing what musicians do, making music, sharing it, finding in that sharing a connection, deeper than politics or nationality. What Werner and Collins proved in those 2 weeks in Rosenheim, what hundreds of musicians proved in hundreds of towns across occupied Germany, was not that music heals all wounds. It doesn't. Karl was still dead, the cities were still rubble, the guilt was still real. What they proved was that music provides a language for beginning to heal, a space where enemies can meet as colleagues, where shared love of beauty creates the possibility of future friendship. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Germany's infrastructure. Allied aid fed its population. Denazification tribunals addressed guilt and accountability. But it was music. Casual concerts in ruined squares, impromptu collaborations between former enemies, the simple act of playing Bach together that began rebuilding Germany's soul. That is why Germans wept when they heard the American military orchestra in 1945. Not from defeat or gratitude or propaganda's effect. They wept because someone had reminded them, through the universal language of music, that they were still human, still worthy of beauty, still capable of creating and receiving art despite everything they had done and everything that had been done to them. And in that reminder lay the seed of everything that followed. Reconciliation, reconstruction, the slow, painful journey from enemy to ally, from conqueror and conquered to partners in building something new from the ruins of what was destroyed. Werner Hartmann, limping through Rosenheim on his crutch, carrying his violin to rehearsals where German and American musicians made impossible harmonies together, understood this instinctively. He never wrote it down, never articulated it in speeches or memoirs. He simply lived it, played it, taught it to students like Karl who carried it forward into the future. The symphony they began, Werner and Collins and all the others, plays still. In the concert halls of Berlin and Munich, in the jazz clubs of Hamburg, in the conservatories where German students learn American music and American students study German composers, in the simple fact that Germans and Americans can stand together on a stage and create beauty without history's weight preventing harmony. That is the legacy. That is what those 2 weeks in June and July of 1945 accomplished. Not the end of enmity. Endings are rarely so clean, but the beginning of something new, the possibility that enemies can become friends, that music is stronger than hatred, that even in the ruins of civilization, beauty persists and humans persist in creating it. Werner would have been satisfied with that. On his deathbed, asked if he had any regrets, he thought for a long moment, then said, "I wish I had thanked James properly. I wish I had told him what he gave me." But perhaps he knew. Musicians always know, even without words. Perhaps he did. Perhaps Collins, playing trumpet in some American concert hall decades later, felt Werner's gratitude across the Atlantic, felt the connection they had forged in those 2 weeks when music proved stronger than war. Perhaps that connection, fragile, human, built not of politics but of shared love for Bach and Brahms and the belief that beauty matters, is what saved both of them, and through them, saved something larger. The faith that humans, despite everything, remain capable of harmony.